everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 17th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Can you believe it? It is episode 450 today. What? I'm losing it. I'm looking at my spreadsheet where I keep all of this, the stats and the titles and the episode numbers and everything going all the way back to the first show in 2014. We're coming up on 10 years, and this is episode 450. I would not be able to do this without your incredible support, without your loyalty, your listenership over the years. And, the way that you share the show with so many people, tell people about it, get them interested as well. And of course, without the incredible financial support from the patrons of the show. I want to give a shout out to the top patrons like I always do. This week they include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. And of course, there's so many more of you. Those are just the ones above a very certain tier, gotta stop recording these things so late at night. Y'all are just the ones above a certain tier, but of course there's so many more, and I thank you all so much. If you are interested in, you know the drill, I say this every week, patreon.com/talknerdy. Oh, but you know what? I do have some news here at the top. I'm really bad about not plugging my own stuff, and there's two things that I want to give a shout out to right here at the top. So I recently co-edited a book, and I think it's available now for pre-order. You can definitely go wherever books are sold and you can get your copy ordered. And I am just pulling up some of the info on it. So my co-editor and I, Stephen Hupp, who is a psychologist at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, we basically recruited a bunch of incredible psychologists and I guess psychiatrists as well, just individuals from different mental health fields to write different chapters for our volume. It's called Pseudoscience in Therapy. And actually, I was wrong, it was published last month, so it is definitely available to purchase anywhere books are sold. Pseudoscience in Therapy, A Skeptical Field Guide. I wrote the intro chapter. Stephen wrote the closing pages, and then in between we have chapters on everything from anxiety, depression, bipolar, pain, dissociation, eating disorders, cognitive decline, personality disorders. And we talk about these things from an evidence-based perspective. What has evidence to back it up? What interventions work? Which ones are plausible and reasonable and have, a mechanism of action that makes sense. And where's the pseudoscience? We know that this happens all the time in mental health fields. There is, unfortunately, a lot of pseudoscience, and pseudoscience has the potential to cause harm. And so we thought it would be a good idea to put together this volume with just people who are at the top of their field sharing their wisdom. And if this is something you're interested in, I hope that you will check it out. The other piece of business right here at the top that I want to draw your attention to is, and I've mentioned on the show a few times, I am finishing my PhD right now. I'm sort of coming up against the wire on my doctoral dissertation, and I'm actively recruiting for more participants. It's a very specific group of people that I'm recruiting from. So what I'm looking for are individuals who are willing and interested in sharing their stories, talking to me personally about their experience. Obviously, this is a research study, so a pseudonym will be used. Any personal information will be redacted. But the dissertation is about medical aid in dying. And so the parameters of those who might participate are individuals themselves. Unfortunately, not family members, not caretakers, not providers, because there is quite a bit of literature from those perspectives. But I am looking to recruit individuals themselves who either have chosen to and have started the process of dying with medical aid, or who are grappling with that decision right now. So we're talking individuals who have a prognosis usually of 6 months or less, or maybe they see that coming on the horizon because of a cancer diagnosis, ALS. There are a lot of different MS. There are a lot of different reasons that might happen. and that you're grappling with this idea of dying with medical aid. I also prefer that you be living in a place where this is a viable option for you. It's legal in 10 states, 11 jurisdictions total, because it's 10 states and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. So if you fit within that group and you would like to share your experience in the hopes that it might help others in the future, let me know. Please reach out. You can reach out to me on social media if you'd like. You can also email me directly to my academic email address, which is csantamaria@email.fielding.edu. The university that I attend for my PhD is Fielding, Fielding, Fielding Graduate University. So my email again is csantamaria@email.fielding.edu. And you can just title it something like medical aid in dying, MAID, dissertation, whatever you like. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your story and to amplify your voice if that's something that you're interested in. Or if you know somebody in your family, a friend, please pass that along. You can see the flyer on my social media. It's pinned to the top of my Twitter right now and also to the top of my Instagram. All right. I guess that's it. So let's dive into the episode. That's enough business there at the top. It's a really good one this week. I know I say that every week, but I promise you I always mean it. So this week I have the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Kate Clancy. She is a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and she holds appointments in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the program in Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology, and also the Beckman Institute for Advanced Science and Technology. She's written for a ton of different outlets. You've probably read her work before if you read science writing, but her new book is called Period: The Real Story of Menstruation. And no matter if you menstruate or you do not, I think that this is a really important conversation that we can all learn from. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Kate Clancy. Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I'm excited to talk about your book and all things in it. I do want to kind of right up front, and my listeners know this already, unless somebody has just been introduced to the show and they're just learning about me for the first time. But my perspective, right, your book is Period: The Real Story of Menstruation. And we're going to get deep into both the biology, the anthropology, the cultural, the feministic side of this, like everything when it comes to reproductive health, maybe from the angles that people are not used to describing it or discussing it. I also want to say from the very, very top, my perspective or my approach to this conversation may be slightly different as a young-ish woman who recently had cervical cancer and was treated for cervical cancer with a total hysterectomy. So I still have a period because I still have my ovaries, but I don't menstruate. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. I still have a cycle, but I don't bleed anymore. And so my perspective on this topic is I may be coming at you with some questions and some interesting approaches as somebody who once had a period and now does not.
I think that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad. So before we get into periods, let's talk about you and your work and, what brought you to this book to begin with. So you are a scientist who really does identify as a feminist scientist, biological anthropologist, right? So tell me about, what is that field? What kind of training did you do to get to where you are?
Sure. When I was an undergrad, I was really struggling between whether I wanted to be a doctor or a writer. And then somehow I fell into biological anthropology. And I think it's because what really pulled me into the field were two big things. One is that I love the sweeping story of human evolution. And I think that, in a lot of ways, anthropologists are storytellers about the human condition. So when I was an undergrad, I was a joint major in biological anthropology and gender and women's studies. And I think in a lot of ways, it's that the second reason that I really fell into bioanth is I realized that we could actually study the body. The biology I'd been exposed to up to that point was animal biology or plant biology or digging up bones or whatever. And then I discovered this whole subfield, human biological variation, or my particular field called reproductive ecology, where we were trying to understand the bodies we inhabit in relation to the environments where we live. And I was just like, that was just the coolest thing. And then it was like, I could study periods on top of all that. And I was completely sold.
I
Um,
love it. Oh,
yeah. And then
oh,
from there, I went on and got my PhD in anthropology. And so that's, as for a lot of professors, that's kind of the traditional training. You get bit by some kind of nerd bug as an undergrad, or potentially out in the world doing some kind of interesting job, and realize that you want to learn more about it. And that's what led me to my PhD.
and so was your dissertation on this very topic, on menstruation?
It was on endometrial function. So the endometrium is the
Ah,
lining of the uterus. And
hmm.
so I was really curious about why we knew so little of endometrial variation and only had some sort of very basic markers for how we understand it. And so that was what I was interested in.
Oh, it's fascinating. I didn't know much about the endometrium, or really, I didn't know much about endometriosis, right? Which is I guess, a disorder, or like a tumor kind of disease state of the endometri. What? Now I can't talk. The endometrium, until I was, diagnosed with cervical cancer, and I found that there was so much crossover with the, obviously hysterectomy can be a treatment for endometriosis. It's the, gold standard treatment for cervical cancer. And as I started to, as somebody in my 30s, talk to those who have boldly gone before, it was rare for me to meet women who had undergone hysterectomy for cervical cancer. All the women that I talked to help me prepare for my surgery had a hysterectomy for endometriosis. And so it was kind of an interesting, I don't know, I learned a lot as I went, because I got to talk to some really brave women who had been dealing with some brutal pain and difficulty for years leading up to their surgeries.
Right. And there are some really good reasons that when you have something like cancer, that you want to remove the thing that has cancer.
Right.
But when it comes to endometriosis does not live just on your uterus.
Right.
It lives
Yeah.
all over your abdominal cavity. And so
Mm-hmm.
hysterectomy, okay, we don't know what the problem is. Let's just rip this organ out of your body.
Mm-hmm.
Does For a lot of people with endometriosis, their endometriosis recurs even after removing the uterus because all of the lesions are still there.
That's so sad. That's so difficult. Oh, yeah. And I had like a kind of a weird, this is like whatever, this is a left turn, but I had kind of a weird experience too, where for so many of these women for whom I guess their endometriosis was really, really concentrated in the uterus, or the bulk of their pain was coming from that, they had this like intense experience of relief after. And I remember they were like, it's going to be amazing. You're going to feel so much better. And I was like, I don't feel bad though. Like, this is really hard. I'm losing something that I didn't want to lose, because, it turns out that I had cancer, didn't feel it, didn't know it. Like, this is not a relief for me. It's only awful pain. I mean, it's a relief psychologically for me, but definitely it was never a physiological relief for me. And so I think we do sometimes also have to be careful. And obviously we'll get into this when we're talking about women's reproductive health. We are not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination. Our bodies are unique, and our experiences with our bodies are unique. And I think we tend to tell stories and have narratives that sort of normal curve us in a way that might not always be helpful for women's own journeys.
Exactly. The hysterectomy example is such a good one. And I do talk about hysterectomy some in the book, because it's kind of this one size fits all solution where if they don't know what to do with a uterus that's acting up in some way, let's just rip it out and see if that solves the problem. Which again, for some people is actually exactly what they need. I think it's possible for us to have a nuanced conversation, right? That for some people, that is exactly what they need and it solves their problem. And I do have friends who have had really severe fibroids, for instance, for whom hysterectomy was amazing. I have people I know where it was part of their gender affirming care, and again, was crucial to their health. And then others who are dealing with, pelvic organ prolapse, because, early removal of the uterus is not always great for everybody. And it kind of depends on the surgeon you have, how well that element of it is going to go in terms of preservation of the pelvic muscles and everything.
Oh, for me, it was definitely, how do you word this? A necessary evil. Like I did not want it, but I also did not want kids. And when my gynecologist said, "Listen, regardless, it's going to go. We can wait up to 5 years to preserve fertility. We have to do biopsies every 6 months to ensure that there's no spread." I was like, "No, no, 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 no. We're taking this out right now. I know I have to lose it anyway. Why would I prolong my pain?" Um, but it was hard. I mean, don't get me wrong. As somebody who didn't want kids, it was still a devastating thing. Like, I didn't want children, but I wanted the choice to say no. And that was lost. Also, just for a little bit of background, and then I promise we'll get off of this. I was diagnosed right when the SCOTUS decision was leaked. My surgery was right when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So that was complicated.
So this was really recent for
Oh
you.
yeah, it was last summer. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, there was a whole complicated conversation around, I remember around Roe v. Wade, and I'm sure this is something that I would love to get your perspective on this because you have a much richer perspective than most individuals because you've studied it both academically but also colloquially. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, there was this very inclusive push within the media. And I've talked about this on the show before, which I am 100% behind, right? Like anybody who listens to my show knows that it's very social justice oriented. The hope is to always be as affirming and as inclusive as possible. But I wonder if there wasn't a better way. I don't know. There was this whole conversation about, instead of saying women, which I very much appreciate because we could be talking about trans men, we could be talking about intersex individuals, non-binary folks. There was this people with a uterus, people with a uterus. And I was like, okay, but what about all of us who identify as cis women or trans men or whatever, who actually don't have a uterus, but for whom these conversations are still really relevant? Like, in an effort to be inclusionary, I think it became actually weirdly exclusionary.
Hmm.
And it kind of fucked with my head, to be honest.
So if I can ask, what part of it felt exclusionary that they were talking about the implications for this for people with uteruses?
I think because my entire life up to that point, it was actually such an important part of my identity. Like, for example, I was moving to, I was applying for internship, and I'm from Texas, but I've lived in LA most of my adult life. And I, as a rule, was like, I will not go on internship in a place where my uterus is not safe. And then out of the blue, my uterus was taken from me because of this thing that was beyond my control. And although on the one hand, now all of a sudden it was safe. And I ended up in Florida. I'm in Florida right now for my internship, which has been a trip. And I no longer did have that concern. Like, honestly, I cannot get pregnant now, which means I will not have to grapple with what it means to need an abortion in a state where that's no longer something I can do easily. At the same time, I think it was such an important part of my identity as a feminist woman that just because it's no longer directly an acute risk of mine, it's still a risk for all women, and I am included. Like, I still felt like I was a part of that group.
Mm-hmm.
And the language that was used, it almost like was salt in the wound. Like, well, you're no longer a part of this group, so you don't have to worry about it. And I'm like, oh God, but I do. So I think that's the difficult thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
psychological more than it is logistic, but it's still real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when I think about what it means to be, the fact that like a lot of the categories we inhabit are actually unstable. When it comes to
100%.
being a reproducing person, that's an unstable category, right? Like for me,
For everyone.
I am, for anybody, but like even as a person I have a uterus, I don't anticipate my uterus having to be removed, but it could certainly happen. But I will remain potentially reproductive until I hit menopause, and then I move out of that category, right? And there are a lot of categories like that we have in our lives that we might have a really strong attachment to at sometimes and not others. And I think, it sounds like that hit you at a very vulnerable time. It's been incredibly important to me to think about how to word things inclusively, because I think that I see it in the opposite way, where I think that when we use language like that, it's an opportunity to invite in allies. I mean, my partner is a cisgender man, and he still thinks that Roe v. Wade matters a lot, and he has never had a uterus and never will.
Right.
And actually using that kind of language is incredibly important because I have a transgender son who has a uterus, right? And so making sure that he receives adequate health care and gets the love and attention he needs, and that we know the kinds of additional dangers on him because of the kinds of things, the kinds of the increase in hate crimes, the increase in suicide, the increase in so many things for being a trans boy, that I want
And
him
also
to
just
feel included in that.
healthcare providers who are so in the dark about that. I mean, some of my trans friends have been lucky enough to find, gynecologists or different healthcare providers who specialize or who have a lot of training in these areas. But others, the stories they tell me about the questions that they're asked, about the things that they have to deal with. I have a trans friend, a trans male friend who, like, whose doctor insisted on a prostate exam. And he was just like, I don't know how many other ways to tell you I don't have a prostate. Like,
Oh my
this is the
gosh.
most uncomfortable situation. Yeah. So it's like, 100%. I think that was always my conundrum, was in an effort and in a real, like, honest, movement to be as affirming and as inclusionary as possible. There are always, maybe not always, but sadly, there are sometimes people whose voices are, how do you word it? Demagnified? I don't
Mhm.
know. I mean, you more than anybody had to really navigate. How did you decide what kind of language to use in your book? And what did you do when you came across a time when you were writing about something and you were like, shit, is this problematic? This,
Mhm.
this is how they talk about it in the literature. And as you know better than anybody, that some of the norms within the scientific literature they just do not keep up.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
how do you grapple with that?
I have a section in the book in the introduction where I expressly kind of lay out my principles around this. And I
Hmm.
describe some of the quandaries of how we think about sex, gender sex, which is another concept that people talk about that recognizes how entangled those two concepts are. And then, what it means to try to write in a gender inclusive way about a topic that people tend to talk about as though it only happens to cisgender women.
Right.
And so, it is actually very important to me that I try to write in a way that includes anybody who might have lived experience with this without, of course, also excluding allies who might also care. Like, I hope that people who don't menstruate also want to read my book.
Right.
But when
Yeah.
I'm describing the literature, I need to be specific about my language. And the thing is that there are times where the gender of the person is relevant to the research question being asked because, for instance, we're trying to understand gender inequality in healthcare. And there are times what's actually relevant is whether or not a person has a uterus. And there are times that what's relevant is, are they currently a menstruating person or not? And understand those are all overlapping, but not fully overlapping categories, right? Because you can
Oh,
have a uterus and not
100%.
menstruate. You can be someone who is a former menstruator. You can be someone who is a former uterus haver. And so to me, inclusion is actually about learning specificity and taking the time to think about, well, who am I talking about here?
Right.
And just
Right.
the one other thing I'll say about this is that, I do think that holding to this principle has really served the research well and improved the quality of the research that we do in our lab, because we were the first group to look at possible menstrual cycle changes with the COVID vaccine. And one of their high priorities we made as we were developing that initial survey was, how can we make sure to recruit as inclusively as possible and use inclusive language so that we do capture the experiences of trans and non-binary people and postmenopausal people and people without uteruses who've had them in the past. We wanted to capture all of those experiences. And it really bore fruit, where we had a very diverse group of participants. We had 165,000 responses. And we saw by the people who were sharing our study that, like, Queer Tumblr loved the study and expressly told people, hey, the language here is not going to cause you any gender dysphoria, so you should participate. We got
Right.
so much positive feedback that we were actually honoring exactly the participants that we wanted, that it again just really reminded me that there is high value in listening and trying to make sure that you are careful and specific in the language that you use.
Yeah, and to be honest, and you may go, bah, when I say this, but there's also such high value in having individuals on your research team. You may have, were you the PI on this, or were you just part of a larger, not just, were you part of a larger team? Co-PI. Okay, so obviously you were in a position of sort of authority within this study, but regardless of who's actually, the first author or not, there is a not just a benefit, but a requirement that when it comes to sitting on a board, when it comes to, developing a curriculum, when it comes to engaging in research, that the actual individuals who are making the decisions have the perspectives, that there is a diversity of voices in the room and that they have a diversity of experiences so that they are thinking about these things. So it's not just about obviously the outcome or maybe the intermediate step, which is utilizing the most inclusive language possible and being very mindful about about making sure that it feels like a safe space for people to participate. But also the very people developing that, like you, have perspectives that have influenced your ability to think in those terms. As long as it's a bunch of like cis white dudes who are making the decisions, these perspectives are just not going to be included.
Right. Right.
And it's scary how much, I hate to say this, these kinds of conversations we're having, the type of research that you do, the way that you write it's still not quite the norm.
Mm-hmm.
It's the bleeding edge. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think pun fully intended with that
one. And so I'm curious, how do you not get I'm so jumping all over the place, but how do you not just get exhausted and cynical every fucking day of your life?
I do. I'm very, very tired.
Right.
I'm so tired. At the end of every day, I just sit there and stare at the wall and go, how did I get through another day? I'm really tired. Something I write about in my preface is another big arm of the research out of our lab is we've done a lot of work on issues of sexual harassment, as well as racial harassment and LGBTQ harassment within the sciences. And that work has led me to be kind of a high profile public facing scientist. I've testified in front of Congress. I co-authored a major report with the National Academy of Sciences. And this work has gone on to affect policy. I've consulted on bills. I've given talks all over the country. And when I was at the height of working on that, I was probably at my least happy because it was so hard, one, to be a person who has experienced who has early sexual trauma that, I don't disclose because it's nobody's business. But then having to live with all the vicarious trauma on top of that, but then also, frankly, to constantly be meeting with administrators and other people from campuses who they wanted me to come give a talk so they could check a little box and say, okay, look, we did our diversity thing, by bringing this one cis white woman to my campus. And when I would try to engage, I'm like, here are the actual bigger things you need to do if you actually want to produce change. And they were like, no, we're interested in the low hanging fruit. What's the little thing we can do? It does get really tiring. And I think for me, this book was actually a major healing process for me because it was a chance for me to sort of look back at the origins of my own discipline and say, how did we get here? And how does understanding that history help me understand where we are today with our science, so that I can actually better just sit in and enjoy the science. I didn't become a biological anthropologist in order to become someone who goes and does any particular type of activism, though I've been an activist my entire academic career. I wanted to do science. And instead, what I found myself doing is feminist science studies, history of science, feminist activism, labor organizing, but it has been impossible to do just science because the problems that happen because of the eugenic history, because of the fact that this ivory tower is inhabited mostly by, if not currently still all cis white men, certainly their values inhabit the incentive structures. I had to address all those things to do my science. So it's very rare that I get to sit down and just do science because I can't do the science I want to do the way the incentive structures are currently set up.
Oh, 100%. Like there is this, you must deal so often with this blowback of like, you're so biased. Like there's this assumption that basically all of this very sort of colonial cis white male, like most of the biomedical science that has been done on, menstruation, that has been done on reproductive health, that has been done on, was like from that perspective. And yet finally it's like we see this movement. I think of Angela Saini, who I've had on the show before. I think she's coming back soon because she has a new book, and this conversation about sort of the history of science and the role that it has played with like cis women, but also like clearly also trans women, trans men, non-binary folks, intersex folks. And it's like the audacity for the chorus to be yelling, "Oh my God, you're so biased. How could you possibly be doing real science? You're doing it from this like feminist lens. That's not real science." When it's like, just because something was normative, the misogynist or the patriarchal lens was normative, doesn't mean it wasn't also or isn't still also a lens.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think you gain much more by disclosing your lens than you do by pretending you don't have one. So I'd rather be upfront with my politics and upfront with my own feminist sensibilities. I think it's also worth noting that actually, like, feminist science is a particular, and feminist theory, these are particular disciplinary perspectives. It's not just, I don't know, like man hating or something like that.
Right, yeah.
Like when I try to explain this to like older male family members, I definitely, they're really confused by like, well, how can you be a feminist and a scientist? And it's like, well, because what I'm talking about is I invoke feminist theory in the work that I do. It's actually very academic and nerdy. It's not nearly as broad burning as you think it is.
Yeah. Oh gosh. And I have to say I 100% agree, and I don't want to get too wonky, but I'm working on my dissertation right now, and I'm doing a very qualitative um, kind of approach. And as I was diving into phenomenology and looking at how I wanted to frame my investigation, I sat on the fence between, do I go very Husserl? Do I go very Heidegger? Like, what is the way that I want to do phenomenology? And one of the big questions is, Husserl said, we all have biases. We need to put them on the fence or put them on the shelf and not, and make sure that we just don't use them. And then Heidegger was like, yeah, that's fucking impossible.
Exactly.
Like, I'd rather just make my biases like deeply explicit at the beginning of my investigation. And then the more I learn, the more I will go back and listen to myself and say, are my biases still what they were? Have they evolved based on, the exposures that I've had, based on the people that I've listened to? And that's that hermeneutic circle. And I think it's been a really cool experience because it's also expanding for me. It's really, wonderful. I love that. My biases are what they are, but that doesn't mean that they're fixed. And I can imagine that over the course of your career, talking to so many individuals who are unique from a gender expression, a gender identity, from all these different interesting perspectives and deeply intersectional, right? So there are literally no two people that are the same. Your biases have probably shifted, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, over the course of the years I spent writing this book, a lot of my thinking shifted. I mean, I think about the last 15 years of my career as a professor here at the University of Illinois, and I just think I'm a completely different person than I was when I first arrived here in so many different ways. And so I think, I love the point that you're making around, I think bias disclosure is actually important. I don't think bias has to be a dirty word. And I think what it allows us to do is be aware of how our own ways of thinking of the world do in fact shift over time.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about some of those explicit biases that you go into. Let's say, obviously that's why you're here to talk about your new book. But also your new book is like an amalgamation of years and years and years of, scholarly inquiry combined with the research that was necessary to write the book. And you do this, you make these biases explicit in your writing. So I hate to be like elevator pitch me, but what kinds of things would you say, here for the listening audience are explicit biases that any reader going into the book should know about kind of where you're coming from?
I think a couple of things. I think probably the biggest thing that is, and this is again a shifting norm, something that I have come to understand and believe increasingly strongly the longer I'm a scientist, have been the intense harms that colonialism and white supremacy have had on the study of science and on scientists themselves, and of course on the participants, that many of whom have been deeply harmed over the course of the kinds of research that people have done. And
here. Can I just freaking here? Like, I'm so tired because I work in these skeptical circles, right? Like, I'm my other podcast, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, that I'm a co-host of. Like, I speak at skeptic conventions, atheist conventions all the time, and I'm getting really short-tempered and short-fused with a lot of the people who literally believe in their heart of hearts that science is this like pure endeavor that has no colonial frame. It's like, it's definitionally colonial.
Mm-hmm. I can tell you my absolute favorite book on this, and the one that most recently I think has done a great job in shifting my thinking, and certainly everyone I know who's read it, is the book Pollution is Colonialism by Dr. Max Liboiron. It's, and I'm saying this for you as well as for readers. It's a Duke University Press book. Dr. Liboiron is just a brilliant writer. You read it for the footnotes. You're like, I didn't know I was going to be a person who would read a book for the footnotes.
I love that.
Like, they're funny, they're kind, they're thoughtful. They add all of these additional elements of perspective to the book. And it's a very short book. It's like, I think, an introduction in 3 chapters. It's not a long read, but Max does this amazing job at introducing concepts of dominant science, of really trying to help people understand the impact of colonialism, again, largely around, their own work within concepts of plastics pollution, but you can apply it so instantly as you're reading it to whatever it is that your own scientific lens is. And it becomes so apparent that, the priorities around colonialism of extraction and unfettered access and being pioneering and being first at things, those have only harmed science. It's those exact incentive structures that lead people to conduct scientific misconduct, right? Because if we decide that firsting, and then again, that's a term from Dr. Liboiron themselves, if we prioritize firsting or being first at something, then, that completely colors like how we evaluate someone's CV for a job. Like, oh, well, they were the first to think of that. That somehow makes it better than the person who did the work better, but was second.
Right.
Yeah. So there are a lot
that incentivizes you to cut a million corners. It's like capitalism, like playing out, right? In science, like it incentivizes you to cut corners to be first. It just does. It's how the system's built. It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. And I think for me, that was like, again, that has only become stronger the more that I do this work and the more that I think about my own discipline. So much of anthropology is predicated on this idea that we, and by we, I mean mostly, white American anthropologists have decided that they deserve access to the peoples of the world for their own research questions. Like, the more I think about it, the more gross that is. I was just in a meeting right before this when I was telling you at the beginning that I was, nervous about being late for this. This was exactly the conversation I was having with one of my really brilliant colleagues, Dr. Jenny Davis, here, who's the director of the American Indian Studies program. And, like, why is it like our entire field is built on this? And if we decided to stop letting American anthropologists just try to get access to wherever they want in the world because they think they deserve to ask their research questions there, our entire discipline would fall down. Like, what would happen?
I see so much parallel with psychology, right? Like, my field is this. There's obviously been amazing movements, feminists, like second and third wave, intersectional psychologists, multicultural psychology, social justice oriented psychology. Yet at the same time, when we look at the origins and we keep falling back to these like deeply disgusting eugenicist kind of, I guess, agendas, and they just rear up. They're just constantly there in the background. And I'm just reminded of this like wonderful TikTok, or I saw it on Instagram because I'm old, but this wonderful video of this woman, a Black female psychologist, who was saying something like, sometimes when I'm feeling really down on myself, I get I remember that like all of Western psychology is based on how well you behave the way that a white male would expect you to behave. So then I realized that all of my diagnoses are really just compliments, and I love that so much because it's hard to break out of that when the frame was so codified at a time when there was no diversity of viewpoints. And that's like all of biomedical science. like as you so interestingly are grappling with these issues in your own field of anthropology, but then your field of anthropology is an anthropological study of the biomedical science. Like it's a meta horrible vortex of bias and awful that you have to, that you're tasked with, you've chosen to be tasked with like teasing out. And yeah, it sounds fucking exhausting.
Well, I clearly should have retroactively asked you to be a blurb writer so I can have, what was it you just said about like this disgusting meta vortex? I want that on the back cover of my book.
It's like you did all the dirty work in the disgusting meta vortex so that the book comes out very clean and beautiful. And that's really ultimately such a difficult thing for you to say, okay, I'm going to talk about this concept that even the concept itself requires a lot of, metacognition around. It requires a lot of grappling with before we can even feel comfortable and safe to put it out on the table. But I honestly, and I say this like fully earnestly, I'm deeply grateful that you that you tasked yourself with doing that work, because now that means that this kind of scholarship is safe for people to engage with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I will say, I feel like this book is sitting on the shoulders of a ton of Black, Latina, and Indigenous writers, especially in anthropology, but in a lot of social sciences and humanistic fields, that they have been doing this kind of writing for a real, and I cite the crap out of them. They have been doing this writing for a really long time. I think all I'm trying to do is like, I'm trying to like take all of their stuff that I hold in my heart and is so precious to me and like give it to this different audience and say, can you please look at the same stuff I've been looking at and like listen to these other, I'm trying to bring it to a science audience, but like, there's some really exceptional work that I cite in the book that I think, I would not have been able to do the disgusting meta vortex if the meta had not already been done by people in the humanities, and I think that's where my intense gratefulness comes for things like science and technology studies and like critical material studies and stuff, is that they've been shining that lens for a while, but we scientists are like, we don't see it. Nothing going on over there.
Right. It almost reminds me of like, I don't know if you remember, but when Obama was in office, he had this, I guess, requirement, this, I don't know what you want to call it, but this intentionality in some of their meetings where if like a woman would say something and then like the men would kind of either, what did they call it? Bro-appropriate it. Just like be like, oh, I had a great idea. Or like if a woman would say something in these meetings, then like the culture was to affirm and amplify. Like this was a requirement of individuals, because we know that there's this gross thing that happens where when a system, which is still very much steeped in misogyny, patriarchy, whatever, white supremacy, is built, the white male voices have more quote unquote authority. Individuals, like and there's all this implicit bias work that we know happens. So it's like, how do we get out of this, or how do we improve upon this? We have to give credit where credit is due, and at the same time understand that like our white male allies, if they offer us allyship and if they say, hey, your voice matters, I want to amplify that to all these other people, sadly, the reality of the situation we live in is that they might be more listened to. Mm-hmm. And it's a tough, and I hear a parallel there. Like you're in a position where people will listen to your voice because of your scholarship, because of your placement, but also because of your privilege. And so you have an obligation, a deep moral obligation to amplify the voices of those who these people are not listening to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as a white person, that's something that is on my mind a lot. And, professionally, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm always doing this well. And I think I have a lot of room to grow, but I try to take a back seat on a lot of things, or, I get a lot of invitations. I mean, for express invitations about the book, I'm going to say yes, because I wrote this book. But for a lot of other things, I have a list that I give, depending on what people are asking of me, of other people to recommend. where I'm really trying to like just say like, look, you really don't, you think you need me to talk to you about this, but you actually don't. You need these much better people that you don't even know to look for because your own bias is just seeing this one white woman in this discipline and you're missing all these other cool people. So, I mean, I think that that's one thing that those of us with a lot of privilege just that we've been born into can do. I think there's a lot more we can do beyond that, but that's at least one step we can take for sure. And then, of course, again, I think citational ethics is actually really important. I try to take the time to name the people that I learned things from because, again, like I was saying before, as a scholar, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for learning from for the most part, scholars of color. And I think if we don't practice good citational ethics, which also, by the way, are what I learned from those scholars, the actual citational ethics. They're the ones writing about this stuff. Actually, Max is another person who does write about citational ethics, among many other people that I cite in the book. I think that those citation practices are really good. So, I chose for this book not to do like the footnote thing because that's very uncommon for science books. But the reference list is very, very, very long. There are between 50 and 80 things I cite for every single chapter. I counted it up once because of one of my early peer reviews that it complained about like some person I didn't cite, who one, it turned out I did actually cite that person multiple times, but two, I went and I was like, this is very well researched. I feel very comfortable saying that I have read enough things here.
Right. Yeah, that's always a tough question with any academic. Like I'm obviously grappling with that as I work on my PhD. It's like, when do you stop? Like when have you reached saturation? But so I would love to, again, I'm using so many fun puns, saturation. Getting back to periods and menstruation, I would love to ask you some kind of, I guess, pointed questions that probably don't have as clean an answer as maybe some people expect. But, one thing that just comes right out in front is like, what is a period? Like, how do you define, and is a period the same thing as menstruation?
Sure. I use them interchangeably. So here's another thing, and this is something that I struggle with. And again, like many of my ways of thinking about the world, evolves over time. So I'm just telling you where I happen to have arrived today. But, there are a lot of people who are really into teaching people appropriate terminology. So they're like, don't use vagina. What you're referring to is vulva. Or don't say menstruation when what you mean is this other thing. And I do think on the one hand, there is value in teaching people the appropriate terminology for things. I really do. But I also think there's value sometimes in just meeting people where they're at and not over worrying about the right term. And I think I think it's context dependent. So there are people who are really hardcore into, if you are bleeding, for instance, on hormonal contraception, that's vaginal bleeding. That's withdrawal bleeding, but that is not a menstrual period. And I'm like,
right.
Come on now. It's like, is it endometrial tissue, blood, and lymph coming from your uterine wall and going out through your cervix and out through your vagina and out your vulva? Is that what's happening? Then like, that's good enough for me. I don't have to call it a withdrawal bleed. But there are people that are really into like, no, you have to call that a withdrawal bleed, not a period. And I'm like, come on now. So, I think when it comes to bleeding, period, menstruation, to me, those are all equivalent. There is a difference between menstrual cycle and menstruation. The menstrual cycle is the day of the first period, the first day of a period, all the way to the first day of a next period. So a menstrual cycle encompasses the time between two menstrual periods.
So that would be on average 4 weeks, but very much on average.
Yeah.
So I guess it's funny, I'm totally just like being like, from my perspective, because this is my podcast, so I'm going to ask you about me. But I've been curious since going through what I went through, which is now, we're looking at 7-8 months ago. That's it. Because the first couple of months after, I was experiencing obviously some like kind of depressive episodes and some kind of intense emotionality. And I was just chalking a lot of it up to, I've just been through something really traumatic and blah, blah, blah. And then I started to realize, okay, I need to like be writing down when I'm becoming really tearful because my ovaries are still in me. And so the brain ovarian connection that is, cyclical is still doing all of the hormonal things that it knows to do, but there's no longer an external signal because I don't bleed anymore. And so I was like, it's like I'm having a period, but I don't know that I'm having a period. And that was like fucking with me a lot. And I didn't even know what to call it. Like, and that was fucking with me a lot. So I'd be talking to my friends and I'd be like, I think I'm on my period, but I don't know. Like what is, so it's like, is that a period? Because I'm not bleeding. I don't know.
I think you should name it what feels most productive and powerful to you.
Right.
You are experiencing an ovarian cycle, right? If your ovaries are producing estrogen, if you are then ovulating and producing progesterone, your ovaries are still going through the same cycle that they would whether or not there is a uterus there. You don't have a uterus doing the uterus stuff, but you still have the ovaries doing the ovary stuff. So what you could be going through is like, basically, I'm experiencing my decline in progesterone right now, which is sort of the premenstrual phase. Or, that sort of low hormone profile period of the first week or so that a person typically is menstruating. So you're still going, you're still experiencing these fluctuations, of course, and that is a very real experience.
And for some, individuals, the experience of a period, obviously, again, we're talking about how people are not monolithic. For some, it's the physical pain of cramping, which of course occurs like in the uterus or around the uterus. For some, it is the hormonal, like you were saying, these hormonal cycles that affect them more. For some, they don't really seem to be affected by their periods. And for others, they're just like deeply affected and they like barf and cry and like have all of these, horrible side effects. And it's like literally everything in between. Like there's no right way to period, is there?
No, absolutely not. One of the things I do try to talk about in the book is the fact that people's lived experiences with their periods, it's layered on. There's a couple different layers of it. One is the social construction of menstruation, which, most of what we've been taught is a really negative framing. When we learn like sex ed and learn first about the menstrual cycle, you don't have, that whatever gym teacher that's explaining the menstrual cycle to you is not actually going to say, hey, at mid-cycle, you might experience a surge of libido and you might experience a surge of creativity. You might experience a really contemplative time in this part of your cycle. Like there are a lot of experiences people have that are cyclical and associated with the menstrual cycle that are not negative. But what we typically talk about is, well, you might feel irritable and bloated. You might feel chest tenderness. You might have menstrual cramping. And all of those things are real too, right? But the things that we're leading with are always negative. So the way that we are constructing periods from the jump is that it's going to be negative. And then on top of that, we have people's very variable experiences. Periods are a nothing burger for some people. And for others, it's, like I can't get out of bed today. And like you said, and everything in between. And we have to do a better job honoring that variation and helping people get treatment for the pain that they're experiencing and other symptoms like just incredible quantities of menstrual blood, like menorrhagia or abnormal uterine bleeding, while also trying to see if we can tease apart that layer on top that is the really strong social stigma that colors our interpretation of our own bodies.
Right. There's this like idea, I can't get away from this idea that, and try and follow my very frenetic mental wanderings right now. But a friend of mine recently had a baby. She's 40. So it was a quote unquote high risk pregnancy. It was very healthy. Everything turned out great. But as she was navigating the healthcare system and like really understanding this experience, and weirdly it was happening in parallel as my diagnosis and surgery. So that was like kind of a total mindfuck. One of the things that she was navigating was, here in the US, we have like just horrible healthcare. And she was trying to figure out, how do I take off of work? What am I owed? Do they actually owe me anything? And the conversation over and over and over was, oh, you just take disability. It was like, but I'm not disabled. Like, I'm not sick. I'm pregnant. Like, that's not a pathology. And we tend to like, a period is that week of pathology when it's like, no, this is a healthy, normal, and in many cultures, celebratory experience. And I think we see this in clinical psychology, and it's something I work really hard to try and push back against. We pathologize, and focus all our energy on how do we fix the things that are wrong instead of going, what is right? And how do we make more space for what is right? And how do we celebrate and, really delight in the good instead of constantly focusing on the bad. And I don't think our culture does that at all. I think we completely have pathologized periods.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, and this is again, like, back when I was a little baby anthropologist, when I was an undergrad, one of the things that delighted me and made me realize that clinical medicine was absolutely not what I wanted to do. And instead anthropology is that, like I said, a big part of this book was me reckoning with the history of both gynecology and anthropology. Both of them have very eugenic origins. But I will say one of the delights of anthropology, one of the reasons I return again and again to it and why I love being an anthropologist is what we seek to do is rather than universalizing people or minimizing them as healthy or diseased, we seek to understand the full range of variation of the human experience. And to me, that's like the coolest question is like, what are the boundaries of the lived experience on something? What are the ranges? Where are the margins? How can we bring people in instead of let's categorize people?
Right. Right. These are all constructs anyway, these categories. They're all just our attempt to maintain some sense of control, to maintain some sense of comfort and organization. But they're all invented categories that we're boxing people into. And we know that because there are always people who don't fit. And so, this is it's funny because we're not really even talking about periods that much. Like I'm looking at the time, I'm like, oh, it's been 48 minutes. We haven't really talked much about menstruation, a little bit, but we've mostly been talking about that meta vortex that we were discussing. And so I want to make sure to protect a little bit of time to actually talk about some of the discoveries, some of the findings, some of the things that you felt that you wanted to delight in as you were, writing this book when it comes to this concept of menstruation. Is there, I don't know, it's such a hard ask. Like, obviously you took, hundreds of pages to write it down. So now tell me what you think in 2 minutes. But is there anything that kind of sticks out for you that's out in front that you feel like, okay, people who are interested, or maybe their appetite is being whetted right now, might like to chew on this a little bit?
I think the two things that come to mind that delighted me most, and again, this came from doing the historical work, like reading about the history of why we thought about these things, as well as then looking at the contemporary scientific literature. One is our understanding of the evolution of periods. It was a really, I had totally bought into sort of the old narrative of why we menstruate. The very old narrative was we menstruate because we're dirty, dirty, terrible ladies, right? And we're evil and diseased and disgusting. But that eventually moved into, which is a very common refrain in evolutionary biology when it comes to anything that we tend to gender feminine. This trait is just useless and not really relevant to evolution. And that's where we'd kind of arrived with periods. That's at least the short answer. But really in the last 10 years or so, there has been a huge shift in our understanding of menstruation and what it's actually functionally doing. And menses itself, like menstrual effluent, the stuff that leaves your body that we think of as waste, has healing properties and is actually crucial to the healing that happens in your endometrium that is happening concurrently as you're like excreting this effluent, it's also sitting in your uterine cavity and healing all of that tissue. And so the effluent itself is not just some random useless thing, but in fact purposeful and important to endometrial cycling. There's also, I think, the actual process of menstruation, we're increasingly, or at least I would hypothesize, or I would say that we can infer from some of the current literature that the process of menstruation is an incredibly important form of practice that that can improve someone's pregnancy outcomes. So somebody with more menstruation practice is potentially going to do a better job creating endometrial infrastructure that then makes pregnancy go better. This is inference. What I'm trying to do in the book is say, look at all this inference. Somebody please do this research.
Right.
But in particular, one of the things that I noticed is, preeclampsia is a major killer of pregnant people. And just makes them very, very sick. And in fact, with COVID, we're actually seeing a massive increase in preeclampsia. People who have had COVID are now at even more increased risk. So it's a very scary disease. It's a type of hypertension. And one pathway by which preeclampsia seems to happen more is among people who've had fewer periods. And so we need to ask ourselves, when we're so big into menstrual suppression and all these other things, whether we are assuming that this thing is useless and can just be suppressed whenever we want, are we considering the downstream consequences of doing that among people who want to have kids, which is, again, not everybody.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's funny. I was just, of course, making it all about me again. Ever since my surgery, I just kind of went off my birth control because I don't need birth control anymore. But then I had this like horrible acne flare up, and I couldn't bear it. Everything in my body went haywire, and I was feeling like my hormones were all over the place. And so I decided to get back on birth control. And there was a big question of, do I have that off week? The placebo week or whatever, like I'm on the ring, so you just take it out for a week. But do I do that, or do I just put in a new one? Because I don't need a period anymore and I'm not bleeding anyway. And so, and that was like a big, interesting question that I don't think there was really an answer to. Like, I think, a lot of the experts I talked to were like, well, there's no point. So yeah, you don't need to go through that hormone, fluctuation. You can just put in a new birth control every 3 weeks. Instead, I'll just write you a prescription for 4 extra rings. But also it's like, but do we even know that? Do we have enough research to know that?
The only thing to think about when it comes to taking taking any exogenous hormone is, do you happen to be a body that is potentially at increased risk for some kind of hormonal dependent disease? And that's where, and again, the data was not great. And then there were these blanket statements made that I think made it so that a lot of menopausal people did not have access to care that would have really improved their quality of life. But this is kind of what happened with hormone replacement therapy a number of years ago. You may remember it was like prescribed to like any menopausal person, like, here's hormone replacement therapy. It's going to make you feel better. And it did make a lot of people feel better. But then they started to realize, for people for whom this might actually become a risk factor, if for some reason maybe they have a family history of hormone dependent breast cancer or things like that. And then the recommendation was, we're going to give it to nobody, make them suffer.
Yeah, they overcorrected. Yeah.
Right. And so is, again, like the thing that I keep trying to do in this book is, could we please have just a little nuance and say,
Right.
For some people, exogenous hormone is life-saving. Or for some people, when they consider the pros and cons of the risks and the benefits, they will absolutely need to choose it. And then for other people, they will consider the risks and benefits and opt out. Instead of making and again, your point about people not being a monolith, let's understand this variability and do a better job counseling people and collecting evidence that will allow us to understand and do a better job recommending different options for different people.
And of course, that broader conversation, I think, is so relevant even outside of this specific focus. Like, and this is something anybody who's listened to my show can go back to several episodes. My area of I don't know, I don't want to call it expertise yet because I'm not an expert yet, but my area of research focus and clinical practice especially is psycho-oncology, existential issues, end of life. And so often I'm having this conversation about cancer intervention and how we historically had this very kind of paternalistic medical model where it was like, this is what you should do, just do it and don't ask questions. And then we sort of overcorrected to this very kind of humanistic, but almost uninformed humanistic medical model of like, here is a menu of options, you pick. And they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not an expert in this field. And finding that middle ground of like, these are the options that are available to you. Let's really talk about the true risks and benefits of each of these options. Doing this may extend your life, but your quality of life might go down. Doing this may not give you more time, but you might be well in the time that you have left, and you might be able to do the things you've been wanting to do. We are not having enough of those conversations. And I think that also applies to young people and older people who are really grappling with, what does my hormonal cycle mean to me? And how can I promote wellness throughout my life?
Sure. And what's interesting about you saying this too is that I agree with you. I've had a very similar experience when it comes to the healthcare menu. I have migraine. I currently I don't have any treatment for it aside from like the things I have figured out that seem to make it better for me. Because the 2 times now I've tried talking to a doctor or medical provider about it, they basically just want to give me the same first line migraine treatment and kind of offer, or like give me kind of options, but don't make me feel like they're real options. And so then I choose nothing. So I'm
Right.
like,
And
I don't,
sadly,
I don't know how to choose, so I choose nothing. I will give you
yeah.
one counterexample though, which
Hmm.
is in contraceptive counseling.
Okay.
Contraceptive counseling. There is, and in fact, I just wrote a follow-up piece to my book for Princeton University Press that's on their website right now that it just came out earlier this week.
Oh,
And
great.
and so we can link to it if you want to see it. But
Yeah.
that talks about the problems of contraceptive coercion and reproductive autonomy. And I talk about this in the book as well, but I follow up on that a little bit more in this piece because I think it's important for people to know that clinicians are actually bringing their cultural biases into the very pressuring way that they counsel people to mostly use long-acting reversible contraception. And in fact, in particular, the biggest one that they tend to recommend is the hormonal IUD, which for some people is magic.
Yeah. And for other people, it's the most painful thing they've ever been through in their entire lives.
Mm-hmm. And then it's hard to get an appointment to remove it. And the average cost of an IUD removal is $262. So when it turns out, and so this is the thing, is I make a joke about, oh, I'm not going to give you instructions for IUD removal in the book because I was trying to explain that it's not a how-to. And then I do give you instructions in this piece. You actually just reach in, you find the string, and you pull it out. You
Right.
can
The
actually do
removal
it on your
part
own.
is much easier than the
Yes.
insertion part. Yeah. Yeah. And it's true. You're so right. Like when it comes to IUDs, I'm so glad you have this piece. I just pulled it up. Reproductive justice includes the right to stop contraception because the entire conversation is rarely had. Like we might talk about the beginnings, but not the ends. We might talk about how to start, but not how to stop. And really the whole life cycle of whatever medical intervention we are contemplating needs to be a part of the conversation. I can't help but go back to cancer biology and to cancer treatments, which are literally life change. I mean, every day there are new discoveries that are just dramatically changing people's lives. And at the same time, a lot of people don't know that some chemotherapies can cause cancer. It's a risk they're willing to take, or that certain types of radiation may induce mutagenic changes later, or that the side effects of this profile, you will become treatment resistant eventually if you're on this chemo for long enough. And soon this chemo will stop working and we'll have to find a new chemo. And there may only be so many lines after that. And I think sometimes I love evidence-based medicine, don't get me wrong, but I struggled with a gynecologist who, for the same reason, I have migraine, but I don't get pain. I only have aura. And the Bethesda guidelines are based on like data from the 80s when contraceptives were way stronger. The actual amount of drug in them was way higher. And they're like, oh, but you shouldn't take birth control because you have migraine aura and you have an increased risk of stroke. I'm like, oh, that's scary. But then when I actually dig into the literature, I'm like, this is not very strong evidence for that. Like at all. And so I'm trying to make an empowered choice, talking to my neurologist, talking to different individuals in my life. And I'm getting pushback because some of the gynecologists that I've worked with are like, no, but that's what the guidelines say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, but there's no such thing as normative. I might be
Exactly.
in the middle of the normal curve on this one thing, but when you add up all the variables that make me, my entire intersectionality, I'm no longer in the middle of that normal curve because that doesn't exist. That's a statistical construct.
Exactly. That was probably my favorite chapter to write in the book, actually, was the one where I talk about statistical normality and then how it's like impossible to apply that, to a menstrual cycle. And
Love it.
the textbook menstrual cycle that you see in terms of like, here's what estrogen is doing and here's what progesterone is doing. If you take a large sample of people and you just calculate their average estrogen and progesterone, it will look like that. If you look at and we were struck by this in our lab because we conduct full menstrual cycle analyses all the time. And we had all of these people that didn't look like that. In fact, pretty much none of our participants look like the textbook picture. And yet when you average them, yeah, they look like that. And it led to us developing a completely different statistical method to measure menstrual cycle variation that nobody was using because we just kind of assumed the correct menstrual cycle is going to kind of look like this. And there might be a little bit of variation based on age or parity or some other things. But for the most part, what we're looking at is like this particular appearance. And what we're saying is actually they're completely different shapes. Like there are people who have 2 estrogen peaks. There are people who have a really sharp progesterone peak and people who have really broad ones. They're actually so much more variable than we've ever really bothered to look at before.
And how important that you're doing this research, which hopefully will be translational. I mean, and then the question is, will some physicians even adopt it? I mean, going back to my friend who just recently had a baby, she was so panicked when she first started trying to get pregnant because she was convinced that she wouldn't be able to get pregnant. When I was like, what is going on? Like, why are you so convinced? Like, yeah, okay, you're 40, but lots of people who are 40 have babies. Like, why are you so concerned? And she was like, because I remember going to a gynecologist once and he told me I was perimenopausal. And I was like, what did your hormone profile look like? And she was like, he didn't even test my hormones. I was having night sweats. And he was like, oh, you're perimenopausal. Turns out I just couldn't drink red wine that close to when I needed to go to sleep at night. And like he just got literally no data and made this wild assumption based on one little, piece of evidence out of context, which is like, it's just bad science.
Absolutely. I wrote a blog post about night sweats because I was getting them over 10 years ago for Scientific American for a similar reason where I was like, what is going on? And it turns out lactating people and people who exercise later in the evening. And there are a lot of reasons that night sweats emerge, even cyclically in cycling people.
I get them when I'm stressed out.
Yes.
Like exactly. It's literally just a function of like, my stress streams. I get night sweats when I have stress streams.
Exactly. And so it is not necessarily a perimenopausal thing. It's only because this person was probably making association in their mind with night sweats and hot flashes, which, are very similar phenomena for sure, but one does not immediately connect to the other. Yeah.
And why would you make that assumption in like an otherwise healthy 32-year-old woman who is presenting with that one complaint? It's like, how about we do a workup? Maybe? What do we think? So yeah, we've got a lot to learn. I hope that those who are listening to my show right now, that some of you are individuals who menstruate, who want to learn more about your bodies. Some of you are individuals who support and love people who menstruate and want to learn more about their bodies. And some of you hopefully are professionals who work in fields where you are supporting individuals. And, you're wanting to challenge some of your biases a little bit, because I think all of those individuals would benefit from reading the research and the writing that you've done. And I really appreciate that you took the time to share so much with us today. And again, I know we didn't get into a lot of specifics. I think that's okay. That's what reading the book is for.
Exactly. Go read the book.
Right, exactly. But like this conversation about why this matters and why this is an important narrative and dialogue that doesn't end here, right? Like this is just the beginning of this narrative and this dialogue. And I hope it continues. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just really appreciative.
No, thank you. And I think, the one last thing I'll say about it is that what I really intentionally, this is more like almost like a natural history of periods as opposed to a how-to book or, there are so many books on the market that are like your guide to menstruation or your guide to, and like, here's how to fix it. And I didn't want to start from a perspective of assuming anything about anybody is broken. And instead, what I want to do is give you all the historical and cultural and scientific context to better understand what's going on, as opposed to I'm going to slap you with a ton of information about, though I will say it does get very nerdy in moments, but like I'm not going to give you some kind of giant overview of here's what periods are. Instead, what I'm trying to do is give you more a natural history of the menstrual cycle. So again, I hope people will read it with that in mind, because I don't think we need another how-to, because a how-to presumes there's something wrong.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with you.
I agree. Oh, what a great note to sort of end the conversation on. Kate, this has been such a joy. I've learned so much. I've been challenged. I've enjoyed really grappling with these concepts. And I'm hoping that those who are listening maybe just, have a slightly different, maybe even not different, maybe not even changed, but just a slightly more open perspective to some of these important issues.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. And so everybody, once again, the book is Period, The Real Story of Menstruation by Dr. Kate Clancy. Kate, thank you so much for being here. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.